let us start. In a sense, I want to cover these two questions. You remember last time we met, there was a very interesting question. You participated in it, and you about how artificial countries are, and states are, and borders are. And I'm sorry, remind me of your name, sorry.
Malak.
And Malak raised a very interesting point in response to your question about, and you made the interesting point that, in a sense, all countries are artificial. All countries are made up. And I entered into this long survey of recent literature, recent theoretical literature on nationalism, and I mentioned Benedict Anderson and his famous argument, imagined communities, and I told you to pay attention to the word imagined as opposed to artificial, as opposed to invented, because imagination does not mean fakeness, but it means something else. Be that as it may, what I'm going to contrast today is, in a sense, two sharply contrasting cases of Transjordan and Egypt. You may think that Egypt is the most natural of countries, the most ancient of nation states, the most stable of countries, and the most given of states, as opposed to Transjordan, which is the most artificial of these new concoctions after the First World War, and the most meaningless of countries. The former King Abdullah, who passed away 10 years ago, very charismatic, very able statesman, a real international statesman, the King of Jordan for some 40 years. He is famous to have said in Arabic about his own country that it was resource poor. This is a country, and he said, بواد غير ذي نفط, playing on the words of a Quranic verse. So not only is Jordan devoid of water, it also has no, unlike Saudi and unlike the other desert kingdoms in the region, it has no oil. And what I'm going to say is something very brief about how this country came to be formed in the period we're still stuck in, the period just after the First World War. But I want you to zoom out a bit and think about it historically and geographically. Think about this country historically and geographically. Think about where it is. What's to the east of it? And Iraq. Saudi Arabia is kind of to the south. So Saudi Arabia to the south. Think about the neighbors, okay? Saudi Arabia with all its wealth. Iraq with all its population. Syria, very old country. The hotbed of Arab nationalism. And Palestine, with the establishment of the Zionists in Palestine, a very dangerous arena, threatening the very existence of what was called first Transjordan, what came to be known as Jordan. Think about, even without having studied this, I'm jumping a bit, but think about the challenges that befell this country in the 20th century. Can you think of some? Refugees coming from, or Syria or Iraq. Now in Syria there are tens of thousands of Syrian refugees flooding into Iraq, into Jordan, escaping the war in Syria. During the Gulf War, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and Iraqis ended up in Jordan. Jordan is a very poor country. If you have overnight, if you have 200,000 more people, you have to feed them, you have to supply services. It's an enormous burden on the country. And in addition to the ideological challenges of Arab nationalism, there's a picture that I'm going to show to you a couple of weeks from now of Nasser of Egypt and Abdullah of Jordan, and the picture itself is very telling. Nasser was a huge figure, physically. He was a big man, big bone structure. And Hussein is a very tiny, short person. And it kind of, it presents the challenges that this country had faced. Economically very poor, geographically doesn't make sense, surrounded by very powerful, regional powers, whether it is Saudi Arabia with all its oil money, Iraq with its population, with its subversive Ba'athist ideology under Saddam. We'll say this later on, Syria and the Israelis. And despite this, the country stood. Since its foundation, as meaningless as it looks, the country did not wither away. It could have been swept aside by any of these invading armies. It could have collapsed under the pressure of the economy. It could have collapsed under the pressure of the refugees. Despite this, some 100 years later, Jordan, of course, is an established player in the country, an important country in the region in its own right, and no one is thinking now of Jordan withering away, disappearing. It's something to think about. It's the question I keep on asking from the beginning of this course about how do we make sense of these borders? How do we make sense of these countries? I keep on saying, and I'm going to say this in extension today, that these countries were shaped to reflect the interests of people mostly elsewhere. And this is most true in the case of Jordan. But somehow it stays. And it tells you something about the tensions in the region. It tells you something about the challenges, the historic challenges to democracy and to local self-government and the rule that is of having polities, having political systems that somehow reflect the interests of the people on the ground. So I want you to think about this. And of course, the other case we're talking about, Egypt, is the most natural of countries, yet, as we're going to say, serious artificial concoctions too, that I want you to ponder this. What was natural about Egypt? Some of you would say, and I'm sure you've heard this before, Egypt is the only country that is mentioned in the Quran. Egypt, of course, is mentioned extensively in the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament. What are we talking about? How can you say it's an artificial country? Well, as a polity, it's an artificial. It could have been shaped differently. The borders could have looked differently. The kind of evolution of the political system could have evolved in a very different way had there been a different constellation of powers in 1914, 1918, 1923, 1930. And again, this is what history, for me, this is why I find it useful. It makes you wonder, it makes you question things that otherwise you would take for granted. And things could have evolved in a different way. We could have ended up with a very different country that we would still call Egypt, but it would have looked very differently. So this is what I want to share with you. And let us start with Transjordan. And a couple of points first. Transjordan, of course, in contrast to Egypt, in contrast to Syria, even in contrast to Palestine itself, further west, contrast to Iraq, is not only a resource-poor area with very little agriculture, very little rainfall, no big rivers, no agricultural base, basically a desert kingdom, a desert province. In addition, I mean, unlike these other areas surrounding it, it's also population poor. It's not heavily populated for these reasons, for these economic reasons. We're not talking about a city like Damascus or Jerusalem. There's very little, settled life under the Ottomans. Under the Ottomans, the region that came to be known as Transjordan or as Jordan, this thing we see on the map here, was part of other provinces, mostly the province of Damascus, up there. Sometimes ruled from Jerusalem, sometimes ruled from Damascus, but really very little to rule anyway. Very few tribal populations, semi-nomadic. In other words, they're not settled. Mostly working on pastures. So they have sheep, some camels, but mostly sheep and goats. And they roam the desert in search for pasture, depending on rainfall. In the north, up in the north, close to the River Jordan, there is some agriculture. And the tribes up in the north of what came to be known as Jordan are different from the majority of the other tribes in the sense that they are more settled, they work in agriculture. So that is one important thing, the tribal nature of the country. Incidentally, I want you to also think about tribalism as something that is not very alien in Damascus, in Iraq, or even in Egypt. But Egypt settled its tribal problems in the 19th century, way earlier, with a city like Cairo managing to establish its hegemony and settle the tribal population. How did we do it here in Egypt? Muhammad Ali gave them title deeds. With title deeds, it's enormous privilege, but responsibility. You settle here, this is the title, this is your land, these are your boundaries, you're responsible, we tax you, we conscript you, we police you. In return, we privilege you, your patriarchal leader is your representative, we bestow medals, feathers, whatever it is that فعلا ريشة على راسه, you put some prestige on the head of the sheikh of the tribe. And this is how we settled our tribal populations in the western desert, in the south, in the eastern desert. This was done by enormous force in the beginning of the 19th century. Tribalism is something that Iran had to deal with a century later. Syria had to deal with, and even the Ottoman Empire, the central lands of the Ottoman Empire, settled the tribal populations later on. And the story we're going to tell today is about predominantly the tribal populations in this region and how they came to be settled and being subjected to some kind of central authority. These again are the things that we take for granted. This is what a country means. But that is precisely the moment of transformation of this tribal or semi-tribal, semi-nomadic population inhabiting the deserts between Iraq and Palestine, the region of Iraq and the region of Palestine, how these people came to be settled in at the end of the 19th century and the beginning, the first, let's say, 2 decades of the 20th century. If you remember the San Remo conference, April 1920, that's where the victors, Britain and France, are distributing the spoils. When it came to Transjordan, to this region, it wasn't called anything. What does the word Transjordan mean, by the way? What does this word trans mean? Not across. It's across the River Jordan. So this is the River Jordan here. And it's the beyond, in other words, there's something there. We just call it Transjordan. It's beyond the River Jordan. So that is, and eventually the word trans got dropped and it came to be known as Jordan. But that is how it was identified. It was, something beyond the River Jordan. The activities are always happening here. This is desert. There's nothing there. Well, something happens there. There are these tribal populations, as I said. And with the establishment of this country called Iraq in the east, with the mandate given to Britain for Palestine in the west, with Syria and Lebanon being given or snatched by France, and the French landed troops in Damascus. We've told the story many times, kicking out Faisal from Damascus. So the French are now up in the north, and the British are looking at the map and wondering, there is now a vacuum that has been created. You establish these new countries, and all of a sudden, what is this region in the middle? How do we deal with it? And the question is, this can be subversive. Why? Well, there's a new power here in the south, in Arabia. Who am I talking about? The Sauds and the Wahhabis. And they are expanding all over the region, from the west first to the east and then up north. Well, we need to limit, the British are thinking, we need to limit this expansion. We need a buffer area. We need an area that can put the pressure coming from these. All of these are tribes. The Wahhabis, Saudis, but they have money and they have a very fierce ideology, the Wahhabi ideology. So there's something subversive as far as the British are concerned coming from the south. We have to limit them. At the same time, these tribes who roam this area can cause havoc to Palestine, which we now have, and to Iraq, which we now have, which is already riven with problems. And then our allies, the French up in Syria, also want to protect and consolidate their newly acquired mandate in Syria. And hence the question is, we need a new country to be formed here. And the question would be, what form will it take, and how to control it, and to make it economically feasible and manageable. The problem, again, in the region is that, as I said earlier, there's no major capital city. So this is one big problem. There's no economic surplus. If there is a capital city that is a government that wants to get revenue, how do you get revenue? Sorry? Taxes. Well, there's no surplus to be taxed. There's not enough economic activity so that you could tax it. That's how poor the country is. And interestingly, given all of this, there's no major ideology like the Wahhabi ideology. It's a vacuum that needs to be filled as far as the British are concerned. So this is one thing I want you to think about when it comes to Transjordan. It's a source of anxiety for the new important player in the region, Great Britain. Now that Britain has established itself in Palestine and in Iraq, and of course much earlier in Egypt, this region now needs to be resolved somehow. So this is one thing. The second is, and this is something I always tell my friends and my students, when you think about these empires, when you think especially about nowadays the American empire, these are complex entities. I'm sure I don't need to say this to you, but you cannot think about the United States as the president of the United States. It's a much more complex political entity than this. The same, so there's Congress, there's the State Department, there is the CIA, there is businesses, there is the oil companies, there's the presidency, and there is a very complex political structure in place, and you cannot, as our leaders think, that the way to cultivate interests and links with the United States is to go and shake hands with the president. It's a much more, I lived in, I taught in Princeton for so many years and eventually in NYU as well. And every year I would see these Israeli diplomats and politicians coming to give talks, because that's an important center of power as far as they're concerned. People like you, students in universities, and they cultivate these, because it's a complex political system. Whereas our presidents would go and shake hands with the incumbent in the White House, think that this is it. Did you get my argument? Yeah. That it's a complex political machinery. The same with the British Empire at that time. There is the War Office back then, especially after the First World War. It's a very important set of players. And there is the India Office, which is a very, also again, important set of diplomats and politicians who handle the most important colony as far as the empire is concerned. Then there is the Foreign Office. There is a big restructuring that happens after the First World War, where there is something called the Colonial Office that is now being headed by Winston Churchill. So this is a very ambitious, perceptive, aspiring young politician, and this is his new turf called the Colonial Office. And the Colonial Office people are sitting in London and thinking what to do with this. They have to fight with the Foreign Office people, they have to fight with the India Office people, they have to fight with the war, not fight, but different contrasting visions of what this area is going to look like, in addition to the local advisors, most importantly, T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell. The local expertise. I'm sorry, I should have sent. So it's a complex situation, and the stakes are high, and the British don't know exactly what to do. What tipped the balance is a very interesting non-entity so far. One of the brothers of Faisal, the older brother of Faisal. We know the story of Faisal. We've seen him on the screen. We know what he did. He ended up being king of Iraq. His brother Abdullah makes a very interesting move in 1920. Just when this San Remo conference is being held, he marches from his power base. This is the Hashemites, you remember this family, with no more than 300 men up north, across the desert, in a sense tacitly recognizes that Aqaba is actually part of Palestine / Syria. And he moves to Ma'an, I think it's here.
From where to where?
From the Hijaz, sorry, Ma'an here. Ma'an, M-A-A-N, it's one of the settlements, not even a city, a small town, a very small town at that time. And he settles there and in a sense starts acting as a prince, as a local power holder. He understands what the British, he understands something about the British and what they are up to. He doesn't want to intimidate them. He doesn't gather thousands. He gathers only 300 men and settles there. His father, the Sharif of Mecca, if you remember him, had already prepared the way for him by sending messages to the local tribal leaders to tell them, my son is coming, yes. Try and be nice to him. And there's a power vacuum, and he steps in and gradually tries to fill it up. He is an ambitious young man. He's very self-centered. The biographies of him, he's vain and self-centered and ambitious, jealous of his brother, his younger brother, Faisal, who ends up in Iraq, aware of the machinations between the British and the French, and if you remember the clip from the movie, dreaming of Damascus. It's Damascus that they have in mind. And Damascus, just 1 minute, Damascus is the hotbed of nationalism. This is the hotbed of Arab nationalism and the young nationalists, students, journalists, intellectuals, writers. Damascus is an intellectual center of the region. They are these nationalists in Damascus who are saying, where is the Arab nation? Where is the Arab kingdom? And had hailed Faisal as their king only to live long enough to see him being kicked out by the French and moved to Iraq, are constantly looking for the Hashemites. And when Abdullah arrives in Ma'an, he has his eye on Damascus. He has his eye that maybe they can support him. These nationalists can look up to him as a possible leader. And they are, reluctant, not yet endorsing him. So it's a very fluent situation. I mean, we're not talking about a country that is being shaped. There's no administration. You understand the picture. It's a very... He just goes there and waits to see. You had a question.
Yeah, when he answered it, I know his eye was on Damascus, but did he have hopes of redominating within Syria, or was
Yes.
it just, okay.
Yes, very much so. He like his father, this is Bilad al-Sham. Bilad al-Sham has a very poetic, evocative term of Greater Syria. In Arabic, this is the hotbed. This is the traditional center of the Umayyad Caliphate way back in the 8th century. It has enormous cachet. It's very loaded with symbolical, religious, historical significance. And these people say, it's ours. And the feeling of anger and betrayal to see Damascus being occupied by the French, bombarded, actually the French arrived with their troops, was enormous. So they, the Hashemites think that this should be their land. They've been promised it, and they've been denied it. So even though he arrives here, he cannot really march on to Damascus. He'll be slaughtered with his men. So he doesn't do this, but he has these ambitions. So he settles there, and then the British, as complex as the British scene is, the different offices in London, the different powers and advisors, and the reports that have been written from the local advisors, the men on the ground, some of them are women, as I said, Gertrude Bell, sending their reports to London and Cairo is very important. Not for anything Egyptians do, but the British diplomats in Cairo have a big conference in in February 1921 to decide on this area. He's aware, he's in Man still, he's aware that his fate is being decided in Cairo. He's waiting to see what the verdict will be. Lawrence goes, and many other diplomats, including Churchill, and the idea of establishing, that's him, Abdullah, of establishing a new kingdom. It wasn't called kingdom, but a new entity in Transjordan, gains ground in Cairo, and they kind of reluctantly see him as the best person to fill in this position and to be, quote unquote, our man in Ma'an, as it is. This is a very important picture showing the leading decision makers in this region at that time. Bell is here, Gertrude Bell. Samuel, who ends up being the High Commissioner of Palestine under the mandate, and Abdullah here, and Lawrence. So important British diplomats, advisors, activists come together, and he sneaks in, and he's establishing himself as a player.
Can you just get his dates back for a second?
Yes. So And that is the decisive turning point. Churchill, who had attended the conference in Cairo, eventually receives these reports by various people saying, this is someone we can do business with. We can give him a probation period to test him out, but let us acknowledge him as somebody who we can rely on. We will give him a title of Emir of Transjordan. We'll give him an annual stipend, and we'll give him some technical assistance, and we'll see how he manages this area. We want him to settle down the tribes. We want him to start a government. There's no government. We want him to start a government, so an administration, ultimately to be able to tax the population, and ultimately to have some kind of defense force. That is what you make. This is how you make a country, so they think. So in Jerusalem, this is a very important date, in March of 1921, he's invited to meet the colonial minister, Churchill, and Churchill, in a famous gesture, shakes his hand. And that is, I don't have a picture of Mr. Churchill shaking his hand. I have a picture of Mrs. Churchill shaking her hands with him. But that is the legitimation of this new ruler. He now is the Britain's man in the region. And as I said, I'm not reading between the lines. This is someone who got an annual stipend from the British Parliament every year, his salary, because there's no money to go by in this newly created country. So he gets a stipend from London. No, they reduced it, and I'm not going to talk about this now. I'm going to talk about it later. But a very important also aspect, when they give him one probation period after another, with enormous tensions between them, because he, in a sense, is not satisfied. As your question, he's not satisfied. He thinks his main power base is elsewhere, is in Damascus, further north. So he too thinks it's Transjordan, but his eyes is across, his kingdom. And of course, the British are telling him, look, this is it. Be content with this. And finally, after 2-3 years, they finally acknowledge him as the emir and starts helping him build an army. The famous Arab Legion, that is a tribal men under British officers, and ultimately paying allegiance to the new emir, not to their own tribal leaders, but to this outsider. He's not from the region. Remember, he's from Hijaz. So this is how artificial the country becomes. This is how artificial the country is, but somehow it became natural. What I'm trying to say is that if you dig deep into the origins of any country, it will look artificial as this, in different forms or shapes. But the question, this is why this dynasty, the Hashemite dynasty in Jordan, is a very clever group of politicians who managed to rule the country, their country, against all odds. And no one now is saying, this is an alien regime, this is from the Hijaz, or the country doesn't make sense. No one is saying this. After so many challenges over the past 90 or so years, Jordan is a stable, in a sense even prosperous country, and has survived against all odds. And I'm going to talk about further challenges to Jordan later on. Questions before moving to Egypt, the other very contrasting case? Yes.
In terms of the tribes, they were welcoming of King Abdullah?
No. In the beginning, especially up in the north, they rebelled. They refused to pay taxes. But the British came to his assistance. First time, the RAF in 1921. Sorry?
Militarily?
Yes. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, flew above in the first incidents. The tribes, they intimidated them. The second time, they sent armored carriers, and they actually snatched the sheep. They snatched the sheep as taxes on behalf of the emir. So he was sending, and the British were sending a very clear signal to the tribes, you have to pay your taxes. Sheep. There's no cash, so they take the actual livestock.
And there was no other ruler at the time, like there was no central government in Jordan, nothing. They just lived in tribalism.
Yes, and he managed to form certain coalitions and try to placate them. His first ministers were not from the tribes. His first ministers were these independents, istiqlalis, nationalists from Damascus. He imported them, and his first prime ministers and ministers were not from the region. But eventually, he incorporated them, especially with the establishment of the Arab Legion, because that's one important way of recruiting local men into the system. It's true that the officers are British, but this is one way of promotion for the tribes in Jordan. Yes.
Were the borders of Jordan established with the Sykes-Picot or when Abdullah came?
With Churchill. Do you remember I mentioned the anecdote, the joke? I think I did, about this awkward thing. The Churchill had a hiccup while he was drawing it, so his hand jarred on the map. And I mean, this is most probably an incorrect anecdote. It actually didn't happen. But it's always mentioned to show how arbitrarily the borders were drawn. The main thing is that it was Churchill. Whether or not he had a hiccup is besides the point. But as you can see here, this is it. This is where the country, in a sense, was put together. Yes.
Did Abdullah in any way envision the Arab Legion as a possible counterforce for the French, and train them militarily in order to at some point enter Damascus? Or?
No, I think by 1924, he was content with his desert kingdom. He understood that the lines had been drawn, and that he had eyes on Palestine, and that's another thing that we'll talk about in details, his relationship with the Zionists. So that became the worrisome border or area of influence. The best books, if you want to read about Jordan under the Ottomans, a very famous scholar, professor of modern history at Oxford University, Eugene Rogan. That's his specialty, Rogan. He studied Ottoman policy in Jordan. So if you want to understand what Jordan looked like under the Ottomans, that is what you should look for. He's the best scholar. All new research, basically 20 years old, new documents. If you want to follow the history of Jordan after this period I'm talking about, I think the best in my mind, the best biographies of King Hussein, as Abdullah's grandson, and of this period, is an Israeli historian, Israeli-British historian, whom we invited last year here, Avi Schleim, also a professor in Oxford University Middle East Center, International Relations. His 3 or 4 books on Jordan, including the biography of Hussein, the present king's father, is incredible. I have never read a political biography that rich, that well documented, the amazing documents that he managed to get from British and Israeli sources of repeated visits. This is the famous story of the secret meetings that King Hussein had had with the Israelis at the house of his London physician over something like 20 years. Documented every single meeting from the 1960s to the 1990s when King Hussein died. It's amazing research. So his name is Avi Schleim. Collusion Across the Jordan is the first book, and then Lion of Jordan is the name of the biography of King Hussein. I'm going to talk about him when we deal with this later period.
You wouldn't recommend the books that the current Abdullah has been putting out? The history of Jordan?
Which one?
Does he not write about history like his father?
I mean, they are, I don't know. I'm sure they are.
Unbiased.
I'm sure they are. And they are, this is a very intelligent family. The king's uncle, Hassan, is an amazing intellect. I remember when I was studying in Oxford, he was invited to be a speaker. And I didn't know him. I was young. I didn't know, what this family was and so on. And I dismissed. I said, oh, yet another Arab politician coming to make fun, to make a fool of himself. And I went to the Oxford Union, the famous debating society of Oxford, and it was a tour de force. It was a very interesting, eloquent, powerful, academic talk about the Middle East crisis. This is about 20 years ago. A very, very serious intellectual figure. And his brother, King Hussein, the late King Hussein, is an incredibly intelligent man. Not only as a politician, but as a human being. And the account, and I'm biased too, I have to say, Avi Schleim's account of this very complex character made sense to me. But, maybe because I haven't read enough, but be that as it may. So again, if you want to read more, it's Eugene Rogan, the early period, Avi Schleim, S-H-L-A-I-M, Avi Schleim. That's the name of the... Okay, let's move to Egypt, where I'm sure the story is much more familiar to most of you. It's a different trajectory altogether. Obviously, it's a much more established country, the bureaucracy, and with everything we've been talking about. The main thing is, if we want to connect with what we've been talking about, if you remember the nationalist movement, especially sparked by the Din Shuai incident in 1906, and the desire to have some kind of political representation, to revive the old dream of constitutional government, to try and limit the power of the monarch, the Khedive at that time. And Egypt has its, or revives its parliamentary life, short-lived under Ismail, with the establishment of what was called the Legislative Assembly in 1914. And of course, the war breaks up in 1914. Egypt is declared a protectorate. All official legal links with the Ottoman Empire are now severed. Remember, the British are there in Cairo, huge numbers of troops in Cairo, and obviously in the Suez Canal region. And the resources of the country are now all geared towards helping in the British war effort. And if you remember when we talked about the Gallipoli campaign, tens of thousands of troops from all over the British Empire land in Egypt. They now have to be fed, they have to be serviced. So the resources of the country are stretched to the limits. The nationalist movement is also very much alive. And the British are basically saying, the British in Egypt, okay, we understand you, we hear you, but you have to help us in our time of need. When the war is over, we'll address your concerns. So when the war is over, this guy and many of his colleagues are pushing for some kind of end to British presence. Just like the Hashemites understood that they had had a deal with the British, the Egyptians, there's no Hussein McMahon correspondence, but the British had been issuing these promises to the Egyptian nationalists and the Egyptian public opinion, telling them, we will grant you some kind of independence after the war. So when the war is over, they're waiting for this independence, which of course doesn't come. The person who leads the struggle for independence is this guy. I'm sure this is a well-documented figure. There are enormous amount of literature on him, Saad Zaghloul, who was Minister of Justice under the British, in the previous decades. He was the Vice President of the Legislative Assembly, whose picture we just saw. He was the Vice President of this assembly. He became Minister of Education and then Minister of Justice. And he's a prominent figure, in a sense self-taught. He studied law, and he's a lawyer. And I want you to think about the different trajectory that Egypt takes compared to Turkey. I spent a whole lecture talking about Ataturk at around the same time, 1918 up to 1924. I'm not going to make an outright comparison, but I want you to think about the comparison. I want you to think about, there are many, many different ways of comparing and contrasting Egypt to Turkey. But I want you to think about how you can construct this comparison around the two men. Yes?
I think the difference is that Ataturk was a military man, and this was an intellectualist and lawyer. So this is a different movement. This is a military movement, and this is more like an intellectualist movement.
What do you how do you think it is? What do you think the significance is of him being a lawyer?
Yeah,
Not only an intellectual, but a lawyer in particular. How?
the rights of why should this country be independent, and he understands that maybe the things that's going on between Britain and the agreements.
So how do you think him being a lawyer would affect how he thinks about the British and the Egyptian case for independence?
I don't know, but it's just basically different than what a military man.
Very much so. It's a very good point. It's a very good point.
Maybe I can't put my hand on something, but I think this is from a whole other perspective, and being a lawyer makes him well aware of implications of the British interference in the politics of Egypt. And
Yes.
why is it significant for them as Egyptians to have independence?
Yes. There is an intellectual, legal side as opposed to a military side.
I think, onto what she's saying, that he'd be more focused on the judicial branch of the state and basically implementing things that have to do with judiciary concepts as opposed to military.
He was concerned about the judiciary, but he was also Minister of Education, so he's also concerned about that portfolio. But it's a good starting point to think about how the Egyptian nationalist movement evolved. Malak?
I think he prioritizes the ideas of constitutionalism and parliaments. And I guess if you contrast that to Ataturk, for him the way for independence is very much linked to a good constitution and parliamentary elections. And
So,
as opposed to Ataturk, who is a military man, so it's about gathering troops and with force.
exactly. Remember what Ataturk did. He actually fought the war first and then had the Grand National Assembly in Ankara to, in a sense, reflect what he had already done on the ground in new political documents. You see, when you go and invade, you establish a legitimacy. What is, in historical terms, they would say, spear won land. You won this land with your spear, with your arrow, with arms. That establishes a legitimacy. He hasn't done this. No Arab leader in the 20th century, no Arab leader could, not a single one could claim any military victory. 20th century Arab history is a history of military defeats. There's not one single victorious general similar to Ataturk. By the way, I'm not a military man. I'm not saying that this is the way forward. I'm just saying it's an interesting contrast. So think about 1919. What's happening? He thinks being a lawyer, this is a perfect case. This is a perfect setup. There are people who, as you're saying, intellectuals, they're sitting, diplomats. I can go and reason with them. I have a good case. I'm a lawyer. I can present the Egyptian case in the Paris Peace Conference. Think about the contrast between Ataturk and... This is someone who's a lawyer who thinks that he can win independence legally. So he wants to go to Paris to represent the Egyptian case and to settle it. There are people who are disputing certain cases, and this is a forum for conflict resolution. Okay, I know how to present the Egyptian case. We've been granted some kind of promise. We have all the ingredients for independence. We have a state. It's functional. It's not like Jordan, far cry from it. So let's just go and present the Egyptian case. So what happens? And the result of this is exile. And the key word here is, what's the name of the delegation? Yeah. So that's the idea of the Wafd, the delegation. That is the significance and the connotations of the word is that it's a delegation that should have been sent to Paris to represent the Egyptian case. And the British are very reluctant. They don't want the Egyptian case to be presented. And they basically tell him, who are you? We know who you are. You've been minister with us, but what right do you have to speak on behalf of the Egyptian people? You see, Ataturk did not have this question. He won. So when he won, he gathers his men and the tribes and the big families and competing generals, and he says to them in the Grand National Assembly, here we are, we're going to forge a new state. So the British are asking him, what legitimacy do you have? What right do you have to speak on behalf of the Egyptian people? We have a khedive. We understand who he is. He's inherited his position through blood from his father. That's fine. There are some religious men here and there, but who are you? So what does he do? He sends his colleagues throughout the country to gather signatures, powers of attorney, tawkilat. And the Egyptian National Archives has them. You can actually see millions of signatures and stamps and seals by illiterate peasants saying, we authorize Saad Zaghloul and his colleagues to go on a wafd, a delegation to Paris to represent our case. It's an amazing degree of mobilization. Now he thinks he has a mandate. It's a popular mandate. He presented stacks of tawkilat, of authorization. So, it's an amazing degree of mobilization throughout the country. And the British are alarmed by this. And what do? They exile him. They pluck him out and they send him out of the country on an exile. And that is what triggered the the 1919 revolution, the biggest mass revolution in Egyptian history before the 25th of January. So this is not a small revolution in some small areas here and there. This is a nationwide revolution against many things, against the postponed independence that the British had not delivered. It's against the hardships that had been encountered during the years of the war. People are tired. And the very successful propaganda and mobilization that Saad Zaghloul and his colleagues in what is now being formed together as a political party, obviously eventually would be called Al-Wafd Party, the delegation party, because that is what became the key word. It became a magical word. Somehow, if the delegation is formed, if it is allowed to be sent, if it actually goes to Paris, if these people manage to present the Egyptian case legally and neatly and formally to the congregation meeting in Paris, Egypt will be declared independent. That was the promise, that was the hope. So the revolution breaks out, and this, of course, is a key moment in modern Egyptian history. There are tons and tons of literature about it. In terms of literature, if you want to read, of course, the best thing is Palace Walk, Naguib Mahfouz, Sulusayya, especially Bain al-Qasreen. It's that moment. Written much later, but it's about that moment. Zaghloul goes to Paris, discovers that despite all his hopes and aspirations, the case has been settled, that the key players in the region will not recognize Egypt's independence, and they would instead recognize Britain's right to somehow stay in Egypt. So that was a big disappointment. I think I will have to stop here because the coming period is very delicate and I don't want to rush it through.